that a small piece of Elm Street is basically straight, because it's such a small piece it looks straight. Jack's camera doesn't have very much distortion. But as you change your direction of view, all the perspective changes. The vanishing points change for those artists among you. And it's very hard to stitch all these together when you've got this photo, and this one overlaps it, and this one overlaps it, this one. In fact, these two are, I guess, the clearest one. Here it looks like it's bending that way. Here it's going uphill, whereas a fair portion of the photo is actually the same thing. Okay, and that's the problem. You're trying to stitch together something which is on that plane and something which is on that plane. Okay, and they don't match up. They match at one point, but they don't match up. The perspective is completely different. Which is why it's very hard to do a full 180-degree panorama of Dealey Plaza and not have a kink in the middle where you sort of match it together. It's not insurmountable though if you've got enough mathematics behind you and a few computer programs and a bit of time. You can stitch them together. So for those of you that haven't had the chance to go down there, which up until 3 days ago included myself, I wanted to show you what Dealey Plaza looks like from the Zapruder pedestal, from about the right height. You can see here, this is one of Jack's photographs here, and there I took the dates out. I deleted all of the people and the cars that were moving because there was enough overlap usually to fill in the details from something else. And with the wonders of modern technology, you can stitch them together without any cut lines, without any seams in that, David. So I'll just, the whole image is about 4,500 pixels wide. So the only way I can show you is to pan the whole thing. A little bit jerky at times. The computer's pretty powerful, but not fully. And that's pretty well what it looks like. As I stood up there with my printout of this, or something similar, I'll show you in a moment, and looked around, it was the only place. It's sorry. No. I'm not finished. Sorry, it was fairly emotional standing up there and seeing where everything happened. It was basically the only place I'll ever visit in the world that I already knew before I went there. I'd worked with this for 6 months or whatever, 9, 8, 10 months, as in this form, and knew what it looked like. Now I didn't. It was actually quite strange because there are many directions in Dealey Plaza which were not photographed at all on the day of the assassination. That's not as clear to people that have lived in the area their whole life, that have actually seen it before they get to this stage. There were many times when I turned a corner, in particular at the top of Elm Street, looking down the Elm Street extension. It felt like I was looking behind a movie set at Hollywood. That never appears just about anywhere, except one photo Jack showed. It doesn't appear anywhere in all of the extant photographs of the assassination. There are many directions of looking at Dealey Plaza which are not shown at all. There's very few viewpoints. There are a lot of people at the corner of Main Street and, well, I better not refer to the streets, I'll try and pull it up on here. Done it again. Okay. There are, well, there's the Zapruder viewpoint. There's a number of people here taking photographs down the street, Willis and Betzner and so on. There's a couple of people up in the depository, or at least Elsie Dorman up there taking a film down the street, down Houston Street, and sort of misses the limo turning the corner. And there's a number of people over here taking photographs looking down Houston Street, or looking from here across Dealey Plaza. But there are many other directions which aren't represented at all. There's nobody at the top of Elm Street looking down from the other sides of the street, for example. And it is quite bizarre when I went here that, as I said, you're looking at it and you know it inside out from a certain viewpoint. You walk 50 yards down the street and turn a corner and you say, I've never seen this in my life, which is quite bizarre. And it says something about the way the photographs were collected and restricted, and the ones that we have now show only selected things, mainly to avoid any overlap as far as possible, with a few major exceptions. So that's that is pretty well what you see in Dealey Plaza, at least from that one position. There is, oh, I'll wait till it comes back. I wanted to show, no, I'll do that in another one. The question then is, there's a panorama, but how accurate is it? All right, it looks nice and seamless, but that could just be a trick. So what I did was I compared it to the topographic survey, the map of Dealey Plaza that was done by surveyors in the late 70s, although it was a revised one in 1981. I don't know the history of that map, and anybody that can tell me would be very interesting. Which up to this point has seemed to be a fairly accurate map. Whatever else the HSCA did, the map they had commissioned seemed to be fairly accurate. The nice thing about the map is that it gives not only a map view, but also gives the heights compared to a reference height of many positions, accurately marked positions in Dealey Plaza. Very important positions, including the Zapruder pedestal and the curve, the top of the curve, the bottom of the curve, all these things have got height elevation measurements, which is quite powerful. I've got of course the north in there, and the scale. Actually, no, I don't think the scale's on it, but the scale is known. And so you can actually use that to compare things in three-dimensional space, both in terms of direction from Zupruder and elevation and depression from Zupruder. And you can compare those a number of points. You've got to pick points where there are measurements and things you can identify off a photograph. I ended up with over 100 points in both compass bearing and elevation for comparison, and generally, with a couple of exceptions, which always turned out to be something that had been and elevation and depression from Zupruder, and you can compare those a number of points. You've got to pick points where there are measurements and things you can identify off a photograph. I ended up with over 100 points in both compass bearing and elevation for comparison, and generally, with a couple of exceptions, which always turned out to be something that had been moved in the intervening 39 years, generally better than about 0.1 degrees of calibration and registration. In other words, we've really mapped this thing out accurately, which is about 2 inches at 100 feet. Sometimes it even seems to be a bit better. Some relative angles seem to be look a bit better than that, maybe a fraction of that. But as an overall absolute accuracy, it wasn't too bad. So one of the things that lets you do is to put accurate grid lines on this panorama and use it as a map. They're a bit small to see, but you might see 050 degrees, 055 degrees, 060 degrees. That's true bearing from true north. So up just over here we've got east, and we go around to south and so on. And here's elevation, okay? So here's 0 degrees, that's everything that's level with the Zapruder camera. Pretty well. We'd estimated where his camera height was based on some of the photographic evidence. That's 0, that's 5 degrees down, 10 degrees down. So you can do exactly the same thing, just use some modern technology to overlay all of these grid lines. And they move along too. So that's a useful thing. You can actually look up and then say, right, okay, I'm standing right here. That's my compass bearing from Zupruder, and this is my elevation from Zupruder. You can have a fairly good accuracy there to a tenth of a degree. Question, what about Dealey Plaza in 1963? It's all well and good to know what it looks like now, or last July. What about 40 years ago? As Jack mentioned, there were two, well, in fact there seems to be more than two. There seems to be many versions of this photograph which people have been providing to me recently. But Gary Mack says it's 5 days after the assassination, and it doesn't really make much difference. It's pretty close to the assassination, where you assume that just about all of these buildings are still where they were 5 days before, or 3 days before. That sort of covers, there's the top and there's the middle. You can see they're not going to stitch together unless you do some tricks. There is also a photograph taken some time later, I'm not exactly sure when, of by the FBI's photographic expert, Lyndall Schoenfeld. I don't know if that's how you pronounce his name, because I never heard anybody say it. He's taking from the Zapruder pedestal, which you can actually check that it's from the right position, down here towards this guy standing in the street, which I presume is marking the headshot at frame 358 or something. I don't know what. Why is there a man standing in the street all the way down there? What happened at that point? I don't have the Warren volume, so I don't know why he showed a photograph of a man standing all the way down in the middle of the street that far down. But in any case, that's not the important part. The important part is we've got a photo which shows things from the Zapruder pedestal. The first question that was raised about this is, how do I know that they are from the Zapruder pedestal? Other than the fact that Gary Mack admitted as much, almost by accident, he said there were reports that they took them from that pedestal. You can compare lines of sight of various objects. If you have one thing in front of another thing, and you're looking at them, and if they line up, and you move your head, they're not going to line up anymore. That's a line of sight. Okay? If two things are at exactly the same point, well, it's going to be the edge of something because you can't see through most things. If you look at, say, this little that monument, there's a statue on the other side, and there's this white thing that sticks up in the same position on this side of Dealey Plaza. I don't know if it's called a monument. And in front of that is this thing here called the peristyle, and they're at a distance apart, and you can see how they line up. And I actually stood on the Zapruder pedestal 2 days ago and saw how far I could move my head before those things are significantly out of alignment. And I couldn't get my head off the pedestal. I was already still on the pedestal before I said, no, I have to come back, I have to come back. I mean, these photographs weren't taken. These photographs weren't taken standing next to the pedestal or on the steps or in the shelter or somewhere else. These were, as claimed, definitely taken from the pedestal. And in fact, Jack did the original work of comparing some lines of sight between photographs he had and objects here and distant buildings. In fact, this and the building behind, the Red Courthouse, is an even better test of that. So we know they're from the top of the Zapruder pedestal, which is important, because if they're from somewhere else.
He took pictures from Zupruder, Muchmore, and Nix, and I had all 3 sets.
Who did?
25 years. The FBI did 3 sets of pictures. That's me, you know. Completely overlapping in all 3 camera positions.
Well, there you go.
So they exist. I got a set of them. Email them.
Yeah. That's, well, I hadn't been in contact with you before the last.
30 photographs.
Yeah. Yeah. This one, which is given to me, is particularly useful. Yeah. Well, that's. So we're making progress already. Very hard from the other side of the planet to communicate with people and obtain things. But the net effect is that you can actually overlay those photographs. Now, you've got to do the same tricks. You've got to take into account a little bit of distortion. You've got to take into account perspective. Then you've got to wrap it onto a sphere surrounding Zapruder, which is the trick that's used to do all this. And then you've got to map it back onto a piece of paper, which is like a Mercator projection, but slightly modified so that it's not so it's equal angles for those physicists in the audience. I just mentioned that. That's basically the tricks you use. The mathematics is a little bit horrific, but computers are good at doing mathematics and they can do it for you. So what you have here is Jack's 2002 panorama poking out the side, because the photograph doesn't go quite that far. Over the top you've got the 3 black and white photographs. Now unfortunately this one's a little bit, the quality I had for this one wasn't too good. It was a little bit half-toned, so when I blow up you'll see a bit of half-toning, you know, little dots like in printing, which if I had a different version I would have been able to avoid. It's a little bit transparent. There's a little bit of transparency there, so you can actually see Jack's colour one coming through. You see it's sort of greenish here, and where there's no Jack one it's just grey. And this one covers a far taller. You see right up here and right down here. The buildings, you notice, are vertical now because I've set it all to the vertical, the horizontal plane. There's Jack's one poking through the middle there, and everything matches up very nicely. If you actually overlay the two and flick between them, there are very tiny differences in some places which probably amount to inches of movement, and that matching up at the end is not quite perfect. The one... Well, the one thing doesn't quite match. I've wondered about this curb here at Elm Street. I'm trying to figure out if it is the original curbing. So many things have changed in, been changed in Dealey Plaza. In fact, this panorama gives you some of it. Of course, this is where the pole is now, on the grass, I think. Jack's one doesn't go far enough down. This is where it was in 1963. There's a pole that never was there. This object here lines up, as I said, very nicely. The sign we're going to come to in a moment is a subject in his own right. The curb, excuse me, the curb here works very nicely, except right in front of Zapruder. And the 1963 curb looks lower than what Jack has for me today. Now, I don't know whether that's something to do with a positioning problem, that one of them took the photograph from further back. Maybe the Dallas Police Department took from the back of the pedestal or something. I'm not exactly sure why there's a slight discrepancy, which is why I was looking at this curbing to see if I could verify that it was the original curbing. Jack says it looks the same colour. It's probably...
Make a difference if we had a 6'7" guy taking that photograph?
Well, it could if they didn't try and replicate the right height. But this isn't the Schoenfeld ones. It could well be that if I use the Schoenfeld ones, I'll get better results. So, but you know, this was what I had at the time. Yeah, height differences or distance, either one could have made a little bit of difference. It's where you'd expect it to be, basically the closest position where we've got two things to compare. But basically, all of this all matches up nicely, and you know, you've got the building which is sort of built in one version and being built in the other version. But it's nice you get a feel for where the other side of Elm Street is, and the edge of the grass. Except you've got sort of ghosts. You've got ghosts of the past and flowers of the past overlaid with Jack's one shining through. What Jack found most fascinating was how many of these lamp poles, and we're talking, remember here, we're talking this accuracy is very, very tight. If you looked at where these things match up, I mean, this building and this thing all matches up perfectly. So when you see that the lamp pole was there and they moved it to there, this lamp pole was there and was there and now it's there, and you know, now there's one there. This one's been moved, that one's been moved. Most of the lamp poles have been moved. And in fact, when we were down there, Jack made me take photographs of all of the. You look at the concrete where the lamp poles were originally in, and there's one obvious place where it came from, where there's holes, you know, 4 holes and a circular piece of concrete. But then there's another patch to the side of it, which is a big rectangular piece, which could well have been, you know, versions 1, 2, and 3, and the hole is version 4, and the current one is version 5. There seems to be a public works program in place to regularly move things around. I'll let this pan back around and I'll tell the best story. Or actually, no, the sign that's here now, we were looking at this sign and looking at the plywood and the bracket on the back, because that comes into a few of the arguments. And I asked Jack, what's that thing? He says, well, I don't know. Never seen that before. And it's a little white plastic gadget. I've got photographs on the computer, but I have to process them. Little white gadget, plastic gadget bolted with a bracket to the sign, and it says wireless rain sensor. Wireless rain sensor. And it's got an FCC, you know, approval number at the bottom. So it measures the rain that's falling in Dealey Plaza. Here it looks like it's bending that way. Here it's going uphill, whereas a fair portion of the photo is actually the same thing. Okay, and that's the problem. You're trying to stitch together something which is on that plane and something which is on that plane. Okay, and they don't match up. They match at one point, but they don't match up. The perspective is completely different, which is why it's very hard to do a full 180-degree panorama of Dealey Plaza and not have a kink in the middle where you sort of match it together. It's not insurmountable though if you've got enough mathematics behind you and a few computer programs and a bit of time. You can finish. Sorry, it was fairly emotional standing up there and seeing where everything happened. It was basically the only place I'll ever visit in the world that I already knew before I went there. I'd worked with this for 6 months or whatever, 9, 8, 10 months, as in this form, and knew what it looked like. Now I did. So the whole image is about 4,500 pixels wide. So the only way I can show you is to pan the whole thing. A little bit jerky at times. The computer's pretty powerful, but not fully. And that's pretty well what it looks like. As I stood up there with my printout of this, or something similar, I'll show you in a moment, and looked around, it was the only place. It's sorry. No. I'm not stitch them together. So for those of you that haven't had the chance to go down there, which up until 3 days ago included myself, I wanted to show you what Dealey Plaza looks like from the Zapruder pedestal, from about the right height. You can see here, this is one of Jack's photographs here, and there I took the dates out. I deleted all of the people and the cars that were moving because there was enough overlap usually to fill in the details from something else. And with the wonders of modern technology, you can stitch them together without any cut lines, without any seams in that, Dave. That a small piece of Elm Street is basically straight, because it's such a small piece it looks straight. Jack's camera doesn't have very much distortion. But as you change your direction of view, all the perspective changes. The vanishing points change for those artists among you. And it's very hard to stitch all these together when you've got this photo, and this one overlaps it, and this one overlaps it, this one. In fact, these two are, I guess, the clearest one.